Ve'ele Toldot Yitzchak ben Avraham, Avraham holides Yitzchak. Vayhi Yitzchak ben 40 shana bekachta es Rivka, bas Bisuel ha'arami, mipadan aram achash lavan ha'arami lo le'isha.
Today's Torah portion is called Toldot. Toldot in Hebrew means generation. But in the book of Genesis, it's more than just a list of names which are recorded in a sequence in accordance to the generations. Toldot occurs in the book of Genesis several times as a certain break or pause marker. When the narrative reaches its peak, when a narrative reaches its climax, then it needs to cool down and the Toldot is inserted. In this manner, there is a Toldot of Adam after the story of Cain and Abel. Then we have Toldot of the Noah after the end of flood, and then Toldot of the sons of Shem after the Tower of Babel. And then we have a long stretch of narrative which talks about the life of Abraham. And when Abraham ends his life and he dies, the Toldot again come as a break marker to indicate the new narrative. In this case, the narrative of the life of Isaac. Among the three patriarchs, Isaac's life seemed to be most peaceful. At least in the life of Isaac, he was always faithful to Rebekah. But there were some issues in which he mimicked his father, particularly when he settled in Gerar, which is on the south, and it's called the land of Plishtim, the land of Philistines. Again, these Philistines are not the famous sea people with whom David and Saul fight. This Plishtim in Hebrew, it's a generic name for the conquerors, and the conquerors were different. The Philistines at the time of Saul and David came from the island of Crete and other Greek islands. They were known in Egypt. They were specifically long-time conquerors of that stretch, which is right in the southeastern corner of the Mediterranean, where today famous or infamous Gaza Strip is located. Somehow that particular piece of land was always occupied by some kind of invaders. And particularly here, this Gerar probably refers to the same geographical region. It was occupied by some kind of invaders, and unfortunately the same name, Abimelech, occurs, which makes many liberal scholars believe that the book of Genesis is just a piece of different fairy tales because the same situation occurs with Isaac and Abraham, and this is why the entire Torah is just a piece of different fragments of ancient folklore. But in reality, it is true that Abimelech, which is also not a proper name, is just an indication of a king's son. But in reality, we see that it's important to have these two stories line up, which shows that Isaac actually inherited some traits of Abraham's character. Even though he loved his wife, Rivka, nevertheless, something was happening. But that's all. With regards to Isaac, this is the most far as he could travel in his family life. But in reality, he was a good family man. And particularly, the narrative of the life of Isaac, which is only one Torah portion, one parasha. It has focus on him, but it focuses on the birth and life of his twins, Jacob and Esau. One is accepted by God, one is rejected by God, as the Haftarah to this parasha is talking about. The Haftarah is found in the book of Malachi, chapter 1, and even though Malachi lives about over 1,000 years after Isaac, and addresses the problem of people of Judah who returned from the Babylonian captivity and are building their homeland, nevertheless, the issue of Isaac and Esau, Jacob and Esau, is addressed there. Right in the very beginning, verse 2 and 3 says, I have loved you, says the Lord, but you say, how have you loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, declares the Lord? Yet I have loved Jacob, but I have hated Esau, and I made his mountains a desolation and appointed his inheritance for the jackals of the wilderness. The Lord loved one twin brother and hated another twin brother. This is a very serious theological question, which is often a source of tension in Judaism. One day I interviewed a famous rabbi who was particularly interested in Jewish-Christian dialogue, and I've asked him a question: what Jews can learn from Christians? And he answered, the concept of God is love. We don't emphasize this, especially in a post-Holocaust world, said Rabbi Greenberg. That is true. If God is love, love is universal. If somebody loves one and rejects another, this is not love. This is a favoritism. Well, the scripture is very clear that God doesn't have a favoritism. So what is this acceptance and rejecting is all about? How does it work? How does God accepting one part of the family and rejecting another part of the family, how is it all about? How does it fit the description and the character of God? How can we really see God's justice in this particular case? You know, that's a big issue. Even it comes into the area of anecdotes. There was one famous Russian Jewish anecdote where the two Jews live by each other and do probably similar business, keep similar shops. And one particular Jew is very prosperous and has money and has a good family and healthy and everything. And another, his neighbor Jew, is very poor. His health is in ruins and his family is a mess. And one day he finally gets upset with God, and he lifts up his eyes and says, God, what is happening? Why are you blessing him and you don't give me a single blessing? And a voice from heaven replies, I just don't love you. Well, does this work here? Does God said to Jacob, I love you, and to Esau, shook his fingers and says, I just don't love you. Well, let's look at the story of how Esau and Jacob were born. It's recorded in the beginning of this parsha in Genesis 25, verses 29 and 34. When Jacob has, when Rachel, when Rebecca was pregnant with 2 sons, they started fighting in her womb. And she asked the Lord, and the Lord has answered to her in the very poetic language of the prophecy. Verse 23, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 people will be separated from your body. And 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. And so the 2 twins were born, and one had a hair all over the body, like some infants, they have hair all over the body. And in the Hebrew culture, in ancient Near Eastern culture, the name isn't just given because of the saint or because of the grandfather. The name represents the trait of the character. And they couldn't determine the traits of his character. They just saw his appearance, and they called him the Esau, which means the hairy one. But his brother was holding his ankle, and they called him in Hebrew Yaakov, which the root here, akav, means to be tricky. Well, the tricky character of Jacob was demonstrated when 2 brothers grew up. It's interesting to note that in 27 it says, both boys grew up. Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field. But Jacob was a peaceful man living in the tents. We have a profession issues here right away. And Esau chooses the profession, which requires quite a temper. Hunting in those days were not just shooting the gun, like today many Americans try to defend their rights to do this, and all these political debates about owning the gun. Believe me, Esau didn't own the gun. In order to make his skill, he had to use a very crude instrument, mainly a dagger and a bow, and in a Bronze Age, these instruments were not sharp. It means that often, especially when he faced a mammal, not a bird, he had to actually, with his hand and with his own strength, chase and kill, because the arrow from the bow could only wound the animal, but in order to actually kill the animal, Esau had to actually overpower it with his own strength. That was the temper which Esau received. And Jacob was sitting with a flock. Isaac has sort of encouraged Esau to do what he was doing because he really liked, instead of some good lamb stew, he liked some wild meat, the bush meat. And that's why Esau was running in the bushes. And one day he would come home and he was hungry. And Jacob was just stirring his lentils, and Esau didn't have time to cook his meat. And he said, just give me that red. And he was really shouting. He really meant this. He said, give me that adum, adum. That's where the word Edom comes from, because it became a second name of Esau. It means he was shouting really loud. Everybody heard that. And basically, the red is the face of the skin when somebody is really, really having a temper tantrum. And Esau did have a temper tantrum, which really he was all about. You know, I once was in boxing when I was in a school. I was a bad boxer. The reason for it was simple. I was just too kind to my partner with whom I boxed, because I believed that as long as I can score some points by just hitting my partner, I can win. I could never become a champion. I would take third or second place, and I would always lose in the finals. And my coach was telling me, you are wrong. You got to be angry. What do you mean you got to be angry? Well, let me show you one day, he said. And right at the final, he took me to show how my friend was boxing, and he was in a different weight category, so I never boxed with him. But he set me in a corner, and at the break, before the third round, my friend was sitting, resting, and my coach was waving the towel in front of him and would tell him, just kill him. Just kill him. Just kill him. And I could hear every time that coach would say, just kill him, and wave the towel, my friend would take the breath and then exhale it. And when he would exhale it, it was like a roaring of a lion coming out of his throat. At the third round, within the first 40 seconds, he ran at his partner with rage and knocked him down. Well, that's a temper. This I've learned. I was a bad boxer. And Jacob was also not as his brother Esau. But he had another trait. And he watched his brother. And he wanted that birthright. Not to say that Jacob was greedy. Of course, with the situation that he was the second, according to the ancient Near Eastern laws, he would receive only 1/3 of inheritance. But in the family of the patriarchs, in their wandering around the land of Canaan, with the people and other families which came from Haran, whom they inherited from Abraham, they were on a mission. They had their altars. They had their services. And the patriarch of the family was to be the priest who would serve at and officiate at the altar. Esau didn't seem to be interested in that aspect of being the first. and having a good relations with his father who favored him. And that was a good issue in the family, because the Torah said that Isaac loved Esau in Genesis, in verse 28 of Genesis 25, while Rebekah loved Jacob. Isaac didn't have marital problems. We don't have any record of Isaac having some concubine or second wife, but the family was an issue there. And the favoritism of husband and wife toward different twins started to play their role. That's why Esau was confident. That's why when Jacob asked Esau to sell the birthright, Esau, with his temper and with certain confidence from his father, really didn't care. Why do I need this birthright? Just give me to eat. I am dying. Yeah, it was his temper tantrum. If we take William Foxall Albright seriously about a $10 billion estate which Abraham left for Isaac, even it didn't grow, the sale of the birthright for a plate of porridge is a bit of expensive meal. There are different classes of restaurants in the world, and some of them you will probably have to sign a check for a couple $100 plus tip. But that was a bit of expensive meal. I don't know if the plate of lentils is worth $3.5 billion, but that's how much Esau paid for his meal, because he just didn't care. But there was more into it. Why God did not favor Esau. It wasn't Esau's temper, because as we will see later, Jacob also had his temper and had his down plays. It was the attitude of Esau toward the inheritance of his grandfather Abraham. Over his life, Esau demonstrably was marrying the local Canaanite women. And that fact brought grief to Esau's parents, to both of them. Even though Isaac favored Esau, that fact brought him grief, the Torah says. Why? Because as we see throughout our course of the study of the book of Genesis, the marriage and family is the most important. We have today a phenomena in Jewish community. In the early 50s, the remaining Hasidic Jews and their leaders moved into New York City and Brooklyn. 90% of Hasidic Jews who lived in Poland and Hungary and Romania were killed during the Holocaust. Those who survived the camps and escaped into New York, they basically went astray. When the rabbis and rabbis of the Hasidic community arrived in Brooklyn, they realized that the only way to restore the strength of the community is to rebuild the family values. They couldn't make it with the first generation, which they saw in disarray and disappointed. But they made parents send their kids to school. And they placed the value of the marriage and family at the top of the list. Now we have in New York a very strong communities. Communities which are growing just because of the family values. Well, there are other issues in Hasidic communities which are negative, but I observed that aspect and bring this observation to illustrate that a Jewish tradition and Jewish community had real sense about this. It had the real sense about this. This is why Esau was a wrong candidate for the birthright, for the continuation of the cause of Abraham, because Esau did not care about bringing up the inheritance of Abraham to his children. And we see it played off later on. Jacob wasn't a sinless angel. Rebekah and he has plotted to keep tracking and getting the birthright at any cost. They used the blindness of the father to obtain the blessing, which of course just didn't work. Isaac did bless, but because of the wrath of Esau, Jacob had to run away and haven't received a penny from material blessings of Abrahamic inheritance. Esau eventually took it all. But taking this inheritance did not make Esau any more wishful to continue the spiritual part of Abrahamic descendants, of Abrahamic inheritance. And that's why the parasha ends with a story about two brothers parting away. And it says here in Genesis 28, verse 8 and 9, that Esau saw that the daughters of Canaan displeased his father Isaac, and Esau went to Ishmael and married, besides the wife he had, Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, and the sister of Nebaioth. Esau does some kind of semblance of what Abraham did by sending the servant back to Haran to bring Rebekah or Rivkah to Isaac. But Rivkah has become the woman of God. We see it in chapter 25 when she prays to God, asking him advice what is happening inside her womb. We don't have this happening with Esau. Esau becomes a polygamist and he has no zeal for the Lord. This is why the book of Hebrews, when it reflects about Esau, talks like this about what has happened with him. In Hebrews 12, verses 15 through 17, it says here, "See that no one comes short of the grace of God, and that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many be defiled, that there be no immoral or godless person like Esau, who sold his own birthright for the single meal. Esau is called godless, immoral person. Godless is the key there. While Jacob wasn't perfect, he wanted to serve God. Esau just wasn't into it. And that's what makes the difference. It isn't God who favors one and dislikes the other. It is us. When we make choices to follow God, God will be favorable to us in response. But when we don't care, God can't help.